Hello? Hear me all right? Great. So before I start, I just wanted to say thank you to the conference hosts, organisers and supporters for putting together this insightful and interesting conference. I would also like to thank them for inviting me here today. I had received the invitation not knowing much about Korea, but after spending a few days here, I'm glad to say that I can appreciate the beautiful Korean natural landscape, people and culture. So on to my presentation. So my name is Adam Poulsen. I'm a research fellow from the University of Sydney. My research background and interests connect to technology design and to diversity, equity, ethics, and social impact. My previous work has focused on the design of robots for the gender and sexual diverse community, or LGBTQ+ community. My previous research focused on LGBT older adults and social robots to help them overcome experiences of loneliness. But today, I'll be speaking more broadly. I'll be presenting on an approach to better understand and include gender and sexual diversity in AI and robotic development. This approach is called queering machines. In the same way that AI ethics involves examining AI from an ethical perspective, queering machines involves examining AI and robotics from a gender and sexual diverse perspective. If this term is unfamiliar, I've tried to define it over the next few slides. So when thinking about the topic of this session, designing digital gender, my first questions are, what is digital gender? How are gender and sex different in relation to digital technologies, or specifically in relation to AI and robotics? What about gender diversity, sexual diversity? What are the particular impacts of AI and robots on gender and sexual diverse people? And how do we account for gender and sexual diversity in the AI and robotics space? In seeking to create a space to answer some of these questions, the focus here is on exploring and advancing gender and sexual diversity in AI and robotics. Here, I'm taking a broader view on designing digital gender, highlighting key considerations relating to gender, as well as sex and sexuality, as they are so closely associated with gender, in relation to AI and robots, and pointing out some of the risks of failing to take those considerations into account. So to provide a shared language to discuss gender and sexual diversity with respect to AI and robotics, the following definitions are important to keep in mind. The first definition is sex. So that is sex is that which is assigned at birth based on sex characteristics or biological sex characteristics. The second definition is gender, which is the internal, deeply held sense of one's gender. The third definition, sexuality, which is one's physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction. So it's important to remember that all these definitions are not binaries. Just as a few examples, on sex, there are intersex people. On gender, there are transgender people. And on sexuality, there are bisexual and asexual people. There is a diversity. Here's a few more definitions. Diversity, which is the variety in the representation of individuals. I've just pointed out what diversity is with those few examples on different non-binary sexes and genders. The other definition is inclusion, which is the representation of an individual user in specific instances. So with those definitions in mind, we can seek now to define queering machines, which is the same, actually, as our focus here. Exploring and advancing gender and sexual diversity in AI and robotics. Or, in other words, examining AI and robotics without holding to binaries, and instead trying to understand and account for the diversity of sexes, genders, and sexualities in these systems by design. With our definition of querying machines and our focus on screen, I want to point out the significance of querying machines as an approach or as a goal. It is poised to advance the inclusion of gender and sexual diverse groups in essential areas, such as healthcare. For example, clinical decision support systems ought to account for diversity, especially for transgender and intersex people, or else these systems are at risk of operating on limited facts, which affects healthcare practitioner decisions and ultimately affects patient health outcomes. To better inclusion would likely lead to better outcomes, or at least more informed decisions. Even seemingly incidental AI application domains are affected by a lack of gender and sexual diversity. These include AI art tools, which we've seen a lot of throughout this conference. They often do not present same-sex relationships in generated images. That is a bias. Another example is chat robots that operate in social media, can be trained by users to replicate societal biases against the LGBT community, such as using homophobic slurs. The last example is mobile dating apps that are designed for women only. They often reject trans women as users based on facial recognition software, which make judgments on one's gender based on socially constructed feminine, masculine facial features. Again, more inclusion is necessary, more querying of machines is necessary. So let's examine gender and sexual diversity as it is impacted on 3 levels in AI and robotics. Those levels are the technical level, the community level, and the target user level, all of which we will explore in depth. The technical level focuses on the diversity of algorithms, techniques, and applications. Here we're wondering how gender and sexual diversity are represented in algorithms, techniques, and applications. Some key questions on the technical level might be, as they're shown here, are the algorithms taking into account all the necessary variables related to gender, sex, and sexuality? And another question might be, are these algorithms classifying users in discriminatory ways? So, when we think about exploring gender and sexual diversity on the technical level, we might be thinking about sex and gender binaries, or the conflation of masculine traits with male gender, or feminine traits with the female gender, which are also inappropriate binaries. I've included this paper as an example of failing to account for gender and sexual diversity on the technical level. The paper shows, the authors in the paper, what they did is they applied an AI tool that used for content moderation online. They used it to measure the levels of toxicity or sort of negative language in Twitter posts from drag queens in the United States. The AI tool reported that the drag queen's Twitter content was highly toxic or negative, but only because the tool was designed without considering the social behavior of this minority group. So to explain, drag queens as well as LGBTQ people may reuse insulting language that's usually directed towards them against each other as a way to reclaim negative language and empower themselves. Without this consideration emerging in the design process, the AI excludes this group by design. The second level is the community level, which centers on diversity in the AI and robotic development community configuration and technique development stages. This level is more about the community of practitioners, researchers, authors, and editors, so on, who are working in AI and robotics. Key questions may include, does the development team have enough gender representation? Is there equitable inclusion of individuals from various genders? And as another question, are all the team members from the same background? So when we're talking about backgrounds, we're now extending diversity to outside of just sex and gender diversity. By extending our lens to consider the inclusion of people from diverse backgrounds, such as different cultures and socioeconomic statuses. This enables us to create more knowledge about culturally and socially determined facets relating to gender, sex, and sexuality. For instance, different perspectives on binary, masculine, feminine characteristics with respect to gender differ across different cultures. Sorry. As an example of failing to account for gender and sexual diversity on the community level, consider the inequitable distribution of genders in academic publishing. Here we can see the unfair distribution of genders on the editorial board of the Artificial Intelligence Journal. So in no way am I commenting specifically on the AI journal, but more on the scientific community more broadly. The editors of this journal in 2022 were 13% women, 87% men, and there was no representation of non-binary or gender diverse persons. So this is the same journal in 2023. For whatever reason, they now have removed that transparency. In my opinion, making matters worse because we're removing some of the transparency around the distribution of genders in journals. The third level is the target user level. This level focuses on the diversity of those interacting with and directly affected by AI and robots. Key questions may include, was the project conducted by taking all of the stakeholders into account? So, was everyone who might be affected by the system taken into account at the development stage, or in the design, or also in the design and implementation and evaluation stages? Another question is, did the research include the users for feedback? Did the development process ask the users for feedback and incorporate that feedback as well? So this is going beyond just accounting for individual or different stakeholders, but actually realizing systems by hearing their voices, their different perspectives, and incorporating those into the design of systems. So I'm asking a lot of questions, but I'm not providing many answers. But it's important to ask these sorts of questions to expose the implications of missing diversity and inclusion considerations in AI and robotics, such as bias and exclusion. This next section will present a few notable implications or negative impacts. The first exemplary implication is linked to the gendering of social and care robots, which often entails the mechanization of women. There is typically a singular view of gender, mostly impacting women, with that view being very stereotypical, presenting a sort of perfect womanhood. This can be seen in the image on the left, which is a robot, a care robot operating out of a hospital in India. I think it's called Sona 2.5. It has been designed in such a way as to feature stereotypically feminine qualities and aesthetics. Gendering robots in this way also lacks nuance, forgetting that gender is fluid and not necessarily committed to masculine and feminine aesthetic qualities. The next example of a consequence of forgetting diversity and inclusion measures in AI and robotics is in the sex robotic space. This particularly affects the target user level I described before. Sex robots are often designed and targeted towards young, able-bodied straight men, and this narrow target user approach excludes everyone else, including persons from the gender and sexual diverse community. Sex robots also perpetuate issues of misogyny, child exploitation, male violence, and the idea that women are programmable and merely subjects of domination. Another example of an implication of failing to account for diversity is gender binaries in algorithms, specifically in gender classification systems. Often these systems conflate masculine and feminine binaries with men and women gender identities. And so, platforms that use gender classification systems, such as social media for purposes of pushing targeted advertisements, will collect user content data, analyze the data, searching for words and sentiment that it considers to be either feminine or masculine, and subsequently assigning a gender to the user, typically either male or man or woman. These processes and the tagging of particular words to be associated with particular gender in AI training datasets perpetuates our own stereotypes and assumptions about gender in society. The last exemplary implication is found in AI-driven medicine. Often medical AI systems, often in medical AI systems, sex and gender diversity is not accounted for, and this risks the safety and health outcomes for particular groups. As I mentioned before, transgender and intersex people are at significant risk if clinical decision support systems are advising healthcare practitioners without the full set of facts about their patients. For example, without a system taking into account a patient's intersex status, practice recommendations, and medicine prescriptions to address hormonal imbalances might present dangers. This last section presents ways forward. Methods to address the inclusion of gender and sexual diversity in AI and robotics to overcome those implications that I just mentioned. So here's three sort of key methods that I would recommend, which we'll go into detail in a second. The first is adding some diversity in algorithms. The second, creating diverse teams, organizations, and designs. And third, developing more inclusive guidelines, policies, and regulation, which remains a problem worldwide. So the first method to increase inclusion and the inclusion of gender and sexual diversity in AI and robotics is adding diversity in algorithms. Two examples of how to do this are shown here on the slide. The first is seeking to add more diversity in AI training datasets representing the broader spectrum of sex, gender, and sexuality beyond binaries. Again, this is very important in AI-driven medicine and social media algorithms. The second example is increased use of gender-neutral biomarkers in medical AI decision-making as an alternative to the first example I gave. This entails making use of other indicators to represent individual differences through more fine-grained dimensions rather than singularly relying on biological sex when making health decisions. Another method of adding some diversity in AI is creating diverse teams, organizations, and design. Research shows that diverse groups in the workplace have more accurate discussions, cite more facts, make fewer mistakes, and are more willing to approach sensitive topics. They also often outperform homogeneous groups. While diverse teams and organizations typically impact the community level, participatory design methods are also crucial for accounting for gender and diversity on the target user level. Participatory design does this by seeking to genuinely understand the needs and values of vulnerable communities. And so participatory design would be another recommendation here going forward. This slide shows a few examples of teams operating in AI and robotics that are seeking to introduce gender and sexual diversity. The first one is Queer in AI, which is a group of queer researchers that aim to raise awareness of queer issues in AI. The second is from my home in Australia, and so it is Pride at CSIRO, which is a professional network of LGBTQ employees and allies at CSIRO, which is an Australian government agency working on sort of cutting edge technology. As another example of creating more diverse design specifically, this paper highlights that by committing to the principles of diversity and inclusion in the design of sex robots, we can break down traditional barriers around gender and sex and masculinity and femininity. The third and final method to increase gender and sexual diversity in AI and robotics is to develop more inclusive guidelines, policies, and legislation. Often, AI developers lack guidance on how to implement human rights considerations, let alone diversity considerations. So more explicit guidelines are needed. Some relevant human rights relating to gender and sexual diversity here include the rights to dignity, non-discrimination, and equality. So while I've cited the EU Charter of Human Rights here, these same rights also emerge from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Regarding better policy and regulation, of course, as top-down governance often lag behind technological advancement, governance relating to AI and robotics remains incomplete throughout most of the world. These next two slides include exemplary papers that highlight the need for more governance in developing robots that account for gender and sexual diversity. Further, these papers also present novel guidelines for practitioners, going beyond just recommending guidelines, but actually showing you some new ways forward. This paper notes that gendered robots exacerbate gender binaries in society and it offers guidelines for robot designers to challenge these gender binaries in the design process. This paper also provides guidelines for accounting for gender and sexual diversity in robots specifically, reflecting on safety as a key principle, as the key principle at risk in interactions with robots, and examining exoskeletons as an example. My point in showing these two papers is that some niche academic work is being done in this space, but top-down regulation, or at least implementation, is still lacking. To conclude, more needs to be done to account for gender and sexual diversity in AI and robotics. And this is on multiple levels that I outlined before, relating to technical design and development, team and community configuration, and target user groups. Going forward, certain methods are necessary to avoid negative implications and advance diversity and inclusion in AI and robotics. Those are adding diversity and reducing stereotypes in algorithms, creating diverse development teams, and improving developer guidelines and developing adequate policy and regulation. Without querying machines in this way, and without querying machines as an approach altogether, we risk bias against gender and sexual diverse groups in AI and robotics. By comparison, consider the bias already perpetuated against other vulnerable groups in AI. In the criminal justice system, ethnicity has been found to be inappropriately used as a predicator in predictive policing algorithms, and recidivism risk, as well as in recidivism risk assessment tools. This exacerbates racial biases. In the labor market as well, hiring algorithms have been found to inappropriately use people's names as a predicator for job offer success. Specifically, unfamiliar names have less success in the job market, exacerbating bias against ethnic minority and immigrant groups. In the same way, AI and robots can and do mishandle gender, sex, and sexuality. Biases against gender and sexual diverse people are not only a problem in our societies, but a problem in AI and robotic design. Thank you.